with Prime Minister's questions to come at noon. This is BBC Two with Politics Live.
It's Wednesday, the 23rd of November. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Catherine Fletcher, Labour MP Barry Gardiner, SNP MP John Nicholson and Camilla Tominey of The Telegraph. Today,
the Scottish Parliament does not have the power to legislate for a referendum on Scottish independence.
That's the judgment from the Supreme Court this morning. We'll hear from Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, in the next half hour.
This latest round of strikes will show how important our members are to the running of the country.
But how important are striking unions?
If politicians do not know the everyday struggles of the NHS, they do not know what the NHS needs.
The Prime Minister is attacked for using private healthcare, but is radical thinking needed to tackle the crisis in the health service? And facing a revolt from his own MPs over plans to boost house building, Rishi Sunak meets Keir Starmer at PMQs. We'll bring you that all live at noon. Well, let's start with that news from the Supreme Court. It broke in the last hour or so. This is the BBC News headline. Judges reject Scottish Government's referendum vote case. This is reporting that judges have rejected the case brought by the Scottish Government, arguing that the Scottish Parliament has the legal right to hold a referendum on Scottish independence. Well, they rejected that case. My opening question, I'm going to start with John Nicholson, unsurprisingly, is does this judgment today make Scottish independence more or less likely?
I think there's a broad body of opinion in Scotland, people who are not yet persuaded by Scottish independence or oppose Scottish independence, who think that the Scottish Parliament should have the right to decide on this and the people of Scotland should have the right to decide on it. I mean, we've been told repeatedly that it's a union of equals and it's a voluntary union. Well, I just asked the very obvious question. If it's a voluntary union, how do you leave? It has to be, surely, elections, mandates and the Scottish Parliament taking a decision.
Yeah, but my question is, does it make it more or less likely to happen? I take what you say.
Well, I think a lot of people will be... we have to remember, of course, that the UK Supreme Court doesn't make law, so it merely interprets law. But I think a lot of people will be very irritated by this, and not necessarily the people who already support the SNP. So
you're hoping that there'll be a sort of galvanising effect, do you, on people that might make it more likely?
I just hope the people of Scotland get to have their say on this, because I think that's democratic.
Well, I know you hope for it.
Well, of course, the thing is that, you know, if the Prime Minister thought that he was going to win this, he would hold it. The reason he's so reluctant to hold it is because he knows he'll lose, and I think he would lose. And if he thought that he was going to go straight to a referendum and that he would have a triumphant vote in it, he'd be desperate to have it.
Well, Catherine, does this judgment, we'll come to what John's been saying in terms of whether the Prime Minister should just hold it if he's confident enough that he'd win. Does this judgment today make Scottish independence more or less likely?
The Scottish independence question was asked in 2014. The polling at the moment shows that only a third of the Scottish people want a referendum this October. They want the SNP to get on with... next October. They want the SNP government in Scotland to get on with the things that are already in that devolution settlement that's 25 years old now. It's got, you know, they want to get on with the NHS. There's a cost of living crisis. There's a war in Ukraine. Their own polling shows that they're just continuing to push ideological stuff at the expense of the Scottish people.
And winning elections.
And I love the Scottish people. I'm from the northwest of England. I've worked in Edinburgh, I've worked in Glasgow, I've surveyed the Highland Streams for the Nature Conservancy Council. The idea that you want friends and partners and that you're a different country is for the birds. So the question was asked, it was decisive, and this is just game playing at a time when there are more important things on.
Right, so presumably you mean this ruling today makes it less likely?
I think this ruling just clarifies existing law. The Lord Advocate, who is, I'm no legal eagle, but I understand is the Scottish Scottish Government's kind of chief law officer, also said that this isn't a question that the Scottish Government can pose. And we don't need to pose it because it was asked in 2014 and decisively answered.
No, the Lord Advocate did actually say it should be something that could be asked of the Supreme Court, which they said they could, they did, and they rejected the case.
Well, persuaded by it.
Is it more or less likely now, independence?
Look,
or the referendum, I should say.
I actually think that if the Prime Minister was smart, he'd allow a referendum. It would be passed through Westminster, because actually they would lose. And let's be clear about this. The SNP claimed to speak for the people of Scotland. OK? But actually, if you look at what happened both in the referendum, there's 5.3 million people in the population in Scotland, 4 million of whom who are over 16 had the right to vote in that referendum. 2.6 million people voted to stay as part of the Union. 2 million people voted to stay as part of the Union. 1.6 million people voted against. That was pretty clear. In fact, you didn't win the election in terms of getting an overall majority in the Scottish Parliament, John, as you well know. You don't have a majority of the seats. You don't have a majority of the seats, and you certainly did not have a majority of the popular vote. So this wrapping yourself in the flag as if nobody else in Scotland has a right to the Soltire.
I've never wrapped myself in the flag. I've never wrapped myself in any flag.
I won't interrupt you, John.
Well, hang on. You've made quite a sort of broad statement there. Do you want to just respond on that, and I'll let you finish?
Yes, I do. At the last election, every single party went into the election saying that if the SNP, or indeed if the SNP and the Greens got a majority as they did, that would be a mandate for an independence referendum. Douglas Ross, the leader of the Tories, was saying that on the very day of the election. We've got to recognise the results of elections, otherwise democracy doesn't function. And Labour, sadly, has only one member of Parliament in all of Scotland. So if there's one party that doesn't speak for Scotland, it's the Labour Party, alas, who's thrown away its majority position in Scotland because of taking stances like this.
Barry?
Well, if I can just respond to say this. It makes no sense, and this is a more fundamental question about constitutional settlements and the settled will of the Scottish people. In a constitutional referendum, it makes no sense that it should depend on whether Mrs McRae down the Lade Braes pops her clogs the night before the referendum. 50% plus one was always a foolish way to conduct a referendum, because it does not give you the settled will of the people. John, just as a matter of principle, would you even accept that actually, if you want the settled will of the people for the next 25 to 40 years, it should actually be on 2/3 or 60%, so that it's absolutely clear, not 50%.
Well, I'm sorry to hear about Mrs McRae, but in our referendums that we've always had hitherto, it's always been accepted that it's a majority. It was a majority when we went into the European Union. It was a majority in Scotland and Wales. In
a mistake both times.
In the Labour Party's Devolution Act. So this is an interesting departure for Labour if this is now
is it in the interest of the Scottish
party
people
politics?
to have this debate now?
Well, we're going to...
It's up to them what they want to have.
We are already talking about it. We're going to continue to do so. I want to hear from Camilla. Does it make it more or less likely, independence?
I'd imagine less likely. I mean, the whole quest for her to now make this election issue seems grossly self-indulgent, doesn't it? I mean, you've got the SNP presiding over longer waiting times, fewer cancer diagnoses, drop rates in English and maths in schools. You know, there's this perception that actually Sturgeon is doing this for her own survival. Got nothing to do with the Scottish people.
Well, let's just hear a little bit more of the judgment from Lord Reid. Take a listen.
A lawfully held referendum would have important political consequences relating to the Union and the United Kingdom Parliament. Its outcome would possess the authority in a constitution and political culture founded upon democracy of a democratic expression of the view of the Scottish electorate. It would either strengthen or weaken the democratic legitimacy of the Union and of the United Kingdom's Parliament's sovereignty over Scotland, depending on which view prevailed.
Lord Reid there, President of the Supreme Court. Can I just show you the reaction immediately from the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon? While disappointed by it, I respect ruling of the UK Supreme Court. It doesn't make law, only interprets it. A law that doesn't allow Scotland to choose our own future without Westminster consent exposes as myth any notion of the UK as a voluntary partnership and makes case for independence. She goes on to say Scottish democracy will not be denied. Today's ruling blocks one route to Scotland's voice being heard on independence, but in a democracy, our voice cannot and will not be silenced. I'll make a full statement later this morning. Tune in around 11:30. We'll bring you some of that. It's going to come in about 5 minutes or so. Let's talk to Kenny MacAskill, former SNP MP. Oh, there it is, by the way, just before we go to Kenny. Stronger for Scotland. That's where Nicola Sturgeon is going to be making her statement, all set up, ready to go in about 5 minutes' time. The former SNP MP, Kenny MacAskill, who now is MP for the Alba Party, joins us now. First of all, your reaction to the ruling, Kenny.
Well, that's what we expected. If you go to the wrong court with the wrong question, then that's where you're going to end up. Many, and I think the Alba Party in particular, were sceptical. This was a flawed strategy from Nicola Sturgeon. But with regard to your questions to other panellists, this makes independence essential. It's all very well if you're wrapped in an ermine robe to be able to sit and wait. Scots are freezing in their home. The ultimate sovereignty rests with the Scottish people, not with a UK Supreme Court or with a UK Parliament. It's the Scottish people that will decide. This may have delayed independence. It's certainly not stopped it.
Right. It was a mistake to do what Nicola Sturgeon did in terms of getting this question looked at, an advisory referendum for the Scottish Parliament.
Absolutely. It's been a cul-de-sac. Many, not just myself, but many other far more learned legal experts were saying exactly the same. That why she pursued it was just to kick the can down the road. What we need to do is to press on. What we need now is an independence convention. The elected representatives of the Scottish people, MPs and MSPs, should be gathering to decide who is sovereign. Is it a Westminster government and a Westminster Parliament, where we have a government that wasn't elected and hasn't been elected in Scotland before I was born and I've got my bus pass? That's entirely unacceptable. Or is it people of Scotland through their elected representatives? And that's why we need an independence convention.
Yes.
And we need to ramp up the case for Scottish independence.
So it was a mistake, John Nicholson, the strategy by Nicola Sturgeon?
No, I don't think it was a mistake. Nicola Sturgeon is a cautious politician. She's a highly successful politician. I think she's on her 4th or 5th Prime Minister now because she's pursued a policy of caution and she wants to bring mainstream Scotland with her. You know, Barry was talking about the SNP people talking for Scotland. It's important always to remember that there are different points of view, and in a democracy you've got to win people over, and you do that, I think, with calm heads, not with hot heads. And in my lifetime, independence has moved from a fringe issue to an absolutely central issue in Scotland, with a majority, an overwhelming majority of young people supporting it. So keep the heat would be my message.
Kenny?
Well, so far John's taken us down a blind alley with this referral to the Supreme Court, which was a classic own goal. We'll see what the First Minister says, but there should be an independence convention. She said that there would be an independence convention, I think, in February of 2020. Since then, nothing has taken place, and it should be called so that we can make it clear that it's the Scottish people that have the sovereignty, not anywhere else. And equally, if we are going to go down the road of a plebiscite election, it has to be a proper plebiscite election. The outcome will be to give a mandate to those with powers elected to negotiate independence, not simply seek another referendum. And equally, it will be fought on a Scotland United basis, not simply by the SNP, because I think this is a juncture at which we will see the mantle pass from the SNP and the Scottish Government to the wider independence movement. The wider independence movement's far deeper, far wider, far bigger. And I think they're fed up with the failed strategy of Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP. It's time for action and it's time for real leadership.
John?
Well, I think Kenny's got a bit of a thing about Nicola Sturgeon. He managed to mention her name there about 5 or 6 times.
Yeah, but is he right?
It's certainly true that in 1997, when we won the Scottish Parliament, we did it by trying to maximise the number of people across social Scotland, from the churches, trade union movements, and a wide body of opinion, to pressurise Westminster into conceding a Scottish Parliament, which the Conservatives said they would never allow, and eventually, of course, had to swing behind.
The Conservatives gave a referendum vote in 2014.
Yeah, the Conservatives said they would never. You're misunderstanding. I'm talking about when the Scottish
I'm
Parliament was established.
The idea that Conservatives are anti-Scotland's not
yes,
true.
indeed, and we've accepted in Northern Ireland, for example, that the people of Northern Ireland are allowed to have border polls every 7 years. So there's a lack of consistency about this. People have to be allowed to change their minds in a democracy. And there's been a lot of water under the bridge since 2014, not least Brexit, which the Scots overwhelmingly opposed.
It is a reserved matter. I mean, that's certainly the sort of legal status in terms of permission for a referendum. That seems to have been upheld today again in the Supreme Court. But Kenny McCaskill, you've sort of outlined an alternative, as you see it, to Nicola Sturgeon's strategy. You've talked in the past about demonstrations at home, going to international courts. But what's the evidence that that would actually work and bring you the desired result?
Well, there's no evidence of that until you try it. But what we're conscious about is that Nicola Sturgeon's strategy has failed. There is no plan B, and we were always told there would be a plan B. We'll see what she says. And that's why the future has to be to ensure that sovereignty rests with the Scottish people. That's why we require the Independence Convention, why we're required to start making sure that our voice is heard. It's simply unacceptable that people in Scotland are freezing in an energy-rich country that we have over half our people fuel poor. So we need to make sure that this just isn't an issue about the Constitution. This is an issue about Scots going hungry, Scots losing their job, Scots being cold in winter when we're energy-rich in a wealthy land.
Yes.
Our resources are being robbed, not simply are we being denied democracy. And that's why they're required. So there has to be change.
Not just a constitutional issue, then, is it, Catherine? And then
very briefly.
No, hang on a second, Kenny.
Very briefly, the resources that are being robbed are the resources of the taxpayers that are pursuing this pointless legal action from the UK Supreme Court. The use of taxpayers' money to address some of the issues that Kenny's just highlighted is absolutely what the Scottish people want. Less than a third of Scottish people want another referendum next October.
You haven't won an election since the 1950s.
Well, hang on.
Scotland.
But, this is whataboutery. If we sort of stick to the issues at hand...
Yeah. Look, the point is this. The polls tell us that 32% of people in Scotland of voting age actually want a referendum on independence. But a much higher percentage of the people in Scotland are desperately concerned about their health service. They're desperately concerned about the education service, which has plummeted under the SNP. So if we're looking forward, then actually, this is a distraction from the real issues. Kenny's talking about people going cold this winter. Absolutely, Kenny, because of a Conservative Westminster government. So the answer for the people of Scotland is to have a government in Scotland, devolved government in Scotland, and a government in England, that in Westminster, that is actually going to work with it like a Labour government.
There's something very unedifying about Westminster politicians telling the people of Scotland, enormously patronising, telling them what they should think and what they should care about.
It's not. It's what they do, John. It's in the polls. Read your own polls. It's what they do say.
You keep losing elections, Barry. That's the trouble.
I'm just giving you the information that your Scottish government has taken in the polls.
Lost an election again last
economy that's supporting
losing
people.
Elections.
It's the power of the British economy that's supporting people through this really difficult winter with financial payments.
Labour's got one MP. The Tories haven't won an election since the 1950s. They're in no position to tell Scots what they think about anything. We had an election last year and the SNP got a majority with the Greens in the Scottish Parliament, something that was designed never to happen.
Let me bring Camilla in at this point. There are two things that come to mind. I think John mentioned earlier the idea of any mechanism. What would be the mechanism be now? The Supreme Court has ruled this out because it says holding an advisory referendum would have political and practical implications. But if the polls were to consistently show a majority in favour of another independence referendum, what would the mechanism be outside the UK government saying you can or can't hold it?
First of all, the polls don't say that. Second of all, 2014 was meant to be once in a lifetime. Equally, you mentioned Brexit there.
Alex Salmond.
Not an agreement.
But equally, John, you mentioned Brexit there. I mean, the SNP were extremely supportive of the Supreme Court's decision to rule that prorogation of Parliament was illegal. And now there's a question about the democracy of this decision-making. So which is it? Where's the consistency? I mean, the Supreme Court is the Supreme Court, isn't it, John?
It's the SNP's job to represent majority opinion in Scotland, which was overwhelmingly against Brexit. Brexit has been disastrous for Scotland. But, Joe, you asked the key question, and I noticed nobody so far on the panel has been able to answer. How do you leave this union?
It's the SNP's job as the Scottish government to deliver the devolved NHS service, the devolved education service, the devolved infrastructure.
Barry?
You can answer it, actually, very easily.
Okay.
When it is clear that there is a majority opinion in Scotland and at the moment it's 32%, as you well know, when it's clear that there's a majority in opinion...
I'm going to interrupt just briefly because we've got Nicola Sturgeon. Let's have a listen. Oh, hopefully we'll have some sound as well. No?
The Lord Advocate's reference, seeking clarity on whether or not the Scotland Act 1998 allows the Scottish Parliament to legislate for a referendum on independence. First of all, while I am obviously very disappointed by it, I do respect and accept the judgment of the court. In securing Scotland's independence, we will always be guided by a commitment to democracy and respect for the rule of law. That is a principle, an important principle, but of course it also reflects a practical reality. The route we take must be lawful and democratic for independence to be achieved. And as is becoming clearer by the day, achieving independence is not now just desirable, it is essential if Scotland is to escape the disaster of Brexit, the damage of policies imposed by governments we do not vote for, and the low-growth, high-inequality economic model that is holding us back. However, we must be clear today that the Supreme Court does not make the law, it interprets and applies the law. If the devolution settlement in the Scotland Act is inconsistent with any reasonable notion of Scottish democracy, as now seems to be the case, that is the fault of Westminster lawmakers, not the justices of the Supreme Court. In addressing the implications of today's ruling, it's also important to be mindful of what the court was not asked to decide, and therefore what the ruling does not tell us. The court was not asked to decide if there is a democratic mandate for a referendum. The mandate and the parliamentary majority for a referendum is quite simply undeniable. Nor was the court asked if Scotland should be independent. Only the Scottish people can be the judge of that. And it was not asked if there is any democratic means by which Scotland can choose independence. The question the court was asked to decide, indeed the only question the court could reasonably answer, was a narrower one. Would a bill providing for an advisory referendum on independence be within the current powers of the Scottish Parliament? In other words, can the Scottish Parliament legislate for an independence referendum without the prior agreement of Westminster? Now, as we know, the court has answered that question in the negative. It has determined that under the Scotland Act 1998, which of course encapsulates the current devolution settlement, even an advisory referendum asking the question, should Scotland be an independent country, is a matter reserved to the Westminster Parliament. What that means is that without an agreement between the Scottish and UK governments for either a Section 30 order or a UK Act of Parliament to change its powers, the Scottish Parliament cannot legislate for the referendum that the people of Scotland have instructed it to deliver. That is a hard pill for any supporter of independence, and surely indeed for any supporter of democracy to swallow. However, as I said back in June when I informed Parliament that the Lord Advocate had agreed to make this reference, it was always the case that in the absence of an agreement with the UK Government, the question of the Scottish Parliament's competence in relation to a referendum would end up in the Supreme Court, if not before legislation, then certainly after any decision by Parliament to pass a bill. So while it is, I think, a statement of the obvious that this is not the outcome I hoped for, it does give us clarity. And having that clarity sooner rather than later allows us now to plan a way forward, however imperfect that might be. Now, I am enough of a realist to know that the immediate questions posed by today's judgment will be for me and the SNP. That is entirely understandable. I'm also long enough in the political tooth to expect some triumphalism on the part of unionist politicians. However, unionists of a more thoughtful disposition, and yes, I do believe they exist, will, I suspect, know that to be misguided. Indeed, they will have been hoping that the court, as the UK government asked it to do, would have declined to answer the substantive question today. That's because they will understand that this judgment raises profound and deeply uncomfortable questions about the basis and the future of the United Kingdom. Until now, it has been understood and accepted by opponents of independence.
We're going to leave the statement. We're going to leave the statement there by Nicola Sturgeon. We will, of course, bring any important development to you later on in the programme. Just briefly before we let Kenny McCaskill go and talk about something else, we didn't quite hear the plan, the way forward that will no doubt be outlined. Are you reassured there will be one, Kenny?
Well, I would hope so, but I have to say I wasn't reassured by that. It seemed particularly vacuous. We do need to have that independence convention. Sovereignty rests with the Scottish people, and we need to be preparing for a plebiscite election that will be a proper plebiscite election and fought on a cross-party, all-party and no-party basis.
All right.
Because this is the right of the Scottish people.
Kenny McCaskill, thank you very much, the Albert MP. Just briefly, Catherine, before we move on, your response listening to Nicola Sturgeon. Are you one of those more thoughtful unionist politicians that she was talking about?
I've just watched somebody that's talking at completely cross purposes to what's in the best interest of the Scottish people. It's continuing to bang on about an ideological quest to a question that was demonstrably settled back in 2014 in a once-in-a-lifetime referendum. She's wasting taxpayers' money asking for a UK Supreme Court opinions when her own Lord Advocate told her that it was unlikely that it was going to be constitutional. She needs to crack on with the job in hand and stop wasting taxpayers' money.
All right, we're going to talk about strikes because the RMT have announced a new wave of strikes in just a moment. But first of all, PMQs, by the way, in just under 20 minutes' time. Let's talk about another BBC News programme, or it's a podcast called Newscast. Familiar faces there, sitting there, waiting patiently, of my colleagues, Chris Mason and Adam Fleming. So, what's the podcast about, first of all? Adam?
So Newscast is basically like a news program, but with loads more personality, loads more behind the scenes, a bit more depth. And you know what? I'm gonna. What
you said about Joe?
Well, I'm actually gonna quote Joe Coburn, because I remember when you came on it a few weeks ago, and afterwards you said, "Oh, I forgot I was actually on." It was just like having a chat with my friends, and that's basically kind of the feel that we're trying to go for. It's like the BBC News, but kind of not really as you know it, and so it's just maybe a bit more fun.
Oh, it's always lovely to be quoted back about something.
Was
Chris,
that off the record?
Yeah, that was off the record. No, it wasn't off the record, of course. Nothing's off the record, is it, completely in a studio? Chris, where do you find it? Where do you find the podcast if you want to listen? And what are you going to be talking about today? No big surprises, I suppose, but anyway.
Yeah, so we're basically wherever you can get your podcasts. So there's BBC Sounds, which you'll hear as just occasionally mentioned, but lots of newscasters, as we call our audience, and indeed us, will find it, wherever they find their podcasts on Spotify or Apple or wherever it might be. You can find Newscast there. And then in terms of what are we going to talk about today? I don't know.
Well, obviously we'll do Scotland and the Supreme Court ruling, because I spent all morning reading the whole thing. It's 35 pages long, because that's as you know, one of my favourite things to do is read the boring documents when no one else wants to. So we'll do that.
All right. Chris, PMQs, as I said, in just over 15 minutes' time. How comfortable is it going to be for Rishi Sunak?
It's going to be interesting, isn't it? I think there might be a splash of the Constitution that features in PMQs a little later on. How is it going to be for Rishi Sunak? I think, is he getting a bit into his stride now doing it? Perhaps he is. He's got a few under his belt.
Do you think he needs to get better at kind of crowd pleasing the people behind him? Because you do not get a sense that the Tories are like, yeah, and he's not really got the zingers yet, has he?
Perhaps not. Although for a while he was deploying that kind of attack line, wasn't he, to Keir Starmer about you tried to make Jeremy Corbyn Prime Minister. The Conservative backbenchers quite like that. I wonder if that might get another outing. But I think from Rishi Sunak's perspective, given that the two previous Prime Ministers for much of this calendar year kind of had most of a lot of the people behind them trying to get rid of them, then actually just the absence of that, sort of defining the positive by the absence of the negative, is probably something for Rishi Sunak. And from Keir Starmer's perspective, I'll drop my phone on the floor, he's had to kind of reconfigure, hasn't he, again, how you approach another opponent across the dispatch box. And in a funny sort of way, some of their character traits are quite similar, Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak. They both do the sort of, we're serious politicians thing, as opposed to leaning too heavily on the kind of, on personality in the way that Boris Johnson kind of kind of did. So I wonder if we're reaching a point where we're getting into something of a groove in terms of how the new PMQs with yet another Prime Minister looks.
Yes, well, we'll check the groove out with our panel just before we get into the chamber. Yeah, go on.
Never an accidental appearance on newscast. I managed to get lager into the first sentence. So they do like you have just a genuine chat in the background.
Oh, well, there you go. Look, there's a reference to being on newscast. What a triumph for you two. Thank you very much. It's lovely to see you. Enjoy later on. We're going to talk about strikes because passengers could face Christmas disruption after the RMT union announced a new wave of strikes on various dates in December and January. The row is over pay, working conditions and job security. Let's hear what Mick Lynch, who is the General Secretary of the RMT union, had to say.
This latest round of strikes will show how important our members are to the running of the country and will send a clear message that we want a good deal on job security, pay and conditions for our people.
Camilla, do you agree with Mick Lynch? Do you think these strikes,
as we like to call him in the press, as he stores up misery for everybody come Christmas? I mean,
but the importance of the service that they run, is that what's going to be at the forefront of people's minds?
We're reminded of the importance of the service they run in that they've got the ability to grind the country to a halt, you know, almost as a first resort now. I mean, how many strikes have been announced? I heard this morning that median wages for rail workers had gone up 38% compared to the rest of the public sector. It's also about working conditions, 28%. And I get that about working conditions, but I think from commuters' point of view, and actually all other workers, you know, I mean, Mick Lynch is great for the rail workers, but not everyone that wants to get to work, or indeed people who work in hospitality, who probably now face redundancies because the whole Christmas market may well be cancelled because of this. I mean, it's sort of look after our own, but not see the wider picture of everyone. And from a Conservative perspective, you know, it begs the question. On the Telegraph, we've been pretty critical of a budget that has pushed taxes up now to record levels. You know, maybe if you allowed more working people to keep more of their wages, then you wouldn't have this sense of disgruntlement, even with inflation at 11%, which, of course, is causing problems.
Interesting. Camilla does think they're quite powerful, the unions, because of the grinding down, as she calls it, people when it comes to trying to get to and from wherever you need to be. Do you agree with that they are powerful and that's why they'll work, these strikes?
Look, whoever they are, whether they're the RMT, whether they're the nurses, whether they're the barristers, whether the public sector workers, they're all feeling the pressure of 12 years of stagnant, in indeed many cases declining wage levels, and now a 10.1 inflation level. Now, there was a deal on the table. There was a deal that was supposed to be made last Monday, and we know that. That was the Rail Delivery Group were supposed to be doing that. They were blocked by the Secretary of State from making that. Now, tomorrow, the unions will again be meeting with ministers. I hope that the deal will be back on the table, that ministers will agree to a deal that will settle this. But the way of doing this is always through negotiation. And Camilla, I don't think it's fair to say, oh, you know, it's a next round of strikes. Actually, striking for those workers is always the last option to withdraw their labour.
Doesn't seem like that,
well, can I just say it's always the last option, because if you're on strike, you're not getting paid. You know, there's a lot of talking that goes on before you get to strike action. And what's happened here is there is a deal that is doable here. It was supposed to be tabled last Monday. The Secretary of State blocked it, and I hope tomorrow he'll put it back on the table.
It's no surprise that you're pro-union, OK? But at the same time,
it's about being pro-working people.
They have proposed over 400 strikes over the last 4 years. How do you think commuters feel about that? I mean, this idea that they can just have the country over a barrel at Christmas is ludicrous. Some of these pay demands, you're saying the wages haven't gone up. Median wages for rail workers have gone up by 39%, exponentially larger than anybody else in the public sector.
Can I just make the point that RMT workers, right, not the medium for rail workers, RMT workers, the ones that, or not the ASLEV rail drivers, but the RMT workers that we're talking about have actually seen their pay decline by 3% in real terms, and they now are faced with 10% inflation. So actually they are looking next year at a 15% real terms cut in their wage levels, in their standard of living.
So you think the strikes are justifiable?
I think these people, they've taken a last resort to withdraw their labour, but there is a deal that is possible.
Well, let's ask Catherine
and the government must stop blocking it.
Let's ask Catherine about that. You served as Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Transport until a month ago, is that right? I mean, Mick Lynch says the Tory government is not allowing a deal in the way Barry's just said to be reached. Is that true?
So the government isn't actually directly in charge of the railways.
I understand that.
But I think there is a nuance to this debate. I think we go straight to pay and straight to cost of living, and I won't repeat the points that Camilla's made. But there's a need to reform the working practices. You know, the railways desperately need modernisation. People are using them less because patterns of behaviour change post-pandemic, and we can't have a protectionist approach to this. We need to all work together. If a crew is based at St Pancras and can go and fix the tracks at Euston, that's not a safety issue. That's not a pay issue. I think we can find a space to talk there. If a tick office is getting used less because people are buying on their apps and on the phone, you know, how can we make sure that that person's labour is involved in boosting the railways? I think there is space to talk there, and I'd encourage people not to be belligerent. I welcome the fact that ministers are actually engaging, but ultimately they're not the employers.
All right, let's talk about this working practice.
Yeah, but hang on. Give the employers the go-ahead to reach that deal.
Sure, but this is about working practices, isn't it? I mean, Catherine is right. In a sense, I mean, do the unions now need to accept that things have changed, particularly post-pandemic, and that actually work patterns need to change
Mick
too?
Lynch has said that repeatedly. There's no issue there. Right. Of course, there is change. Unions constantly embrace change. But the point is this. It's a negotiation. If you want that change, then obviously you've got to protect those workers' wage levels and cost of living. Families up and down this country are suffering, and that's just one example of it. The nurses, the public sector workers, everybody's
I think I should probably have a wee say on this. The thing about Mick Lynch is that he is a formidable champion for his workers. That's his job. His job is to stand up for his workers, and he runs circles around Tory MPs whenever he debates them.
But
the Labour Party would be delighted to have him in Parliament.
He's a great performer, but does he actually have a case here?
Of course he's got a case. Now, Camilla mentioned hospitality. Camilla mentioned hospitality. Hospitality is a big sector in my constituency. I tell you what's killing off hospitality is Brexit and not being able to get workers in. There's a huge... I don't know why you're laughing, because if you talk to... Camilla mentioned hospitality and people not being able to get to work. I'm responding to her point. For the hospitality sector, a shortage of labour is the biggest problem. And the fundamental problem, of course, with the railways is privatisation, which the Tories pushed through, which was the worst possible form of public ownership.
ScotRail is owned by the Scottish Government, but also has also been striking over pay and conditions.
It is now.
Right. And so what did nationalisation do in terms of preventing strikes?
Well, of course, it's a very new thing, as you know, public ownership. Again, I fail to see why that's funny.
Well,
nobody wants strikes. It's a perfectly fair question, which I'm answering. The ScotRail has been taken into public ownership relatively recently. It was privatised previously, and an offer is available for the workers there. I hope they take it, but I absolutely defend their right to go and strike if they want to do so.
Yes.
I think John is correct to highlight that Mick Lynch is a wonderful advocate for his body of people. Yeah. You know, I grew up with unions all around me. They've done a lot of good. But I think it's all about context in the middle of a post-COVID rollout with a war in Ukraine, a cost of living crisis.
But they're part of that, aren't they, Catherine?
The tax, yeah, absolutely. And they're also benefiting from the £400 we've given to everybody. And if they're lower paid, then they'll get £300 a day, I think. But the point is that the taxpayer has put 16-odd billion, don't quote me exactly, into the railways since the pandemic. That's other taxpayers subsidising that railway. We need it to change. We need it to work. So you can get to the Christmas pub or the Christmas shop.
Networks pay out some of that to their shareholders?
Right.
Yeah.
We need to be able to get to the shops at Christmas.
How much of that
we need to be able to see our families to go home at Christmas.
How much of that 16 billion reached the workers, and how much of it reached the shareholders.
The workers advocate brilliantly, but right now we are punishing everybody by continuing months and months and months.
Hang on. Let me just show you this on the front page of the Daily Mail, Catherine, because the question here is when will we rein in the union's intent on Xmas chaos? This is legislation that we have been promised would be the minimum service levels. I suppose the government could hope to avoid the sort of disruption that we are talking about if you brought it in, but you haven't brought it in.
I checked this morning before I came on. It's been introduced. We're carrying on with it. I think what we've got to do is give some certainty to people like me that live in the northwest of England and use the trains to get to work, that I can get home again. It's having quite a constriction on people's lives and lives.
Is Labour going to take the railways back into public ownership out of interest?
We need to give certainty.
I certainly hope so, John.
I remember Barry
that's a question that Barry enjoys.
Enthusiastically for this, and I've got a feeling that has disappeared into the mists.
It's certainly not the pledge that was made by Keir Starmer in the leadership contest, but Barry still believes.
I have full faith that Keir will honour his pledge.
Well, can I have one other question, which is, I mean, should below-inflation offers be made, or do they have to be above-inflation offers in order for these strikes to be called off? It could be the nurses. Yeah.
It's a matter for negotiation between the workforce and their representatives and the management.
But as a principle, if we're talking about a cost of living crisis and inflation is running at just over 10%, Catherine, I mean, what sort of offers should be made?
Well, I think I can tell you what offers shouldn't be demanded, which is 17% pay rise. But what we're doing is we are actually helping the most vulnerable with the cost of living crisis. And the idea that you have to immediately align wages, we're using different mechanisms within government to make sure that people can get through this. And then we need to kind of push on with growth. And what these strikes will do is make it more difficult for us to grow our way out of this economy and fight inflation.
Barry?
Yes,
briefly?
Can I just say, the three major supermarkets in this country have increased their profits from pre-COVID levels by 97%. The food producers, the food manufacturers, have increased their profits by 255%.
Right.
Now, there's a lot of people who are already rich who are making a heck of a lot of money.
So do you believe in overinflation?
No, I believe that what is going on is gouging and profiteering by many, many companies in this country.
Don't accept that at all.
Well, I'm sorry, it's there.
You speak to the food producers in my patch, and they are really struggling because of the grain increases, for example, because of the war in Ukraine.
Of course, and there's a preliminary inflation, which is the war in Ukraine, and which is the problems of the post-pandemic.
Inflation will kill us if we don't get hold of it.
But what's then happening is that would mean you would expect their profit margins to stay the same. They haven't. They've doubled.
All right.
They've doubled.
I'm going to come to something very briefly with you because we're running up to Prime Minister's questions in just under 5 minutes' time. I also want to point out that we're going to have any dubious facts that are brought up during Prime Minister's questions. They'll be checked over by our political research unit. Yes, by my colleague Peter Barnes. But before we get into the chamber, NHS bosses, let's just show this BBC News story. NHS bosses in Scotland discuss having wealthy pay for treatment. Now, you will, of course, remember this story from a few days ago. It was from a meeting. The details of the meeting or the minutes were leaked. Talk of a two-tier health service. Isn't one of the founding principles, John, of the NHS that it is free at the point of delivery? Yes. What did you make of this?
I totally disapprove of it, totally reject it, and the First Minister has done so as well. There can be no question of having a two-tier service. Scotland has significant health challenges. We've got free prescriptions in Scotland. Some of the things that are going on in Scotland are pretty good. We've got more doctors per head of the population than anywhere else in the UK.
But so you won't even entertain
there are good
this
things.
idea.
No, I think it's entirely the wrong thing.
We can see the chamber, by the way, filling up ahead of Prime Minister's questions. Camilla, should it be considered? I think we've just got a graph, which we may or may not be able to show, but it's waiting list for hospital treatment in England, just to be clear. But you can see how big it is. It's reached a record 7 million in September. The 18-week treatment target hasn't been met since 2016. There are also targets missed in Scotland on A&E treatment and people waiting for cancer treatment Should it be considered that wealthy patients might pay for some treatment if they wanted to?
Wealthy patients do already pay for treatment if they've got private health cover. I don't know why they're demonised. There's 10% of people with private health cover. We had a load of criticism of Rishi Sunak maybe having private health cover from The Guardian, all of the employees of whom are offered private health cover covered by The Guardian. I mean, most professional organisations offer private health. If I could take the weight off the NHS by having my health care covered privately by my own company, I will. And I speak as a mother of 3 who was in A&E only on Monday night because my youngest cut her face and I had to go and get it steri-stripped and cleaned out and seen to. And I was sitting there thinking, perhaps this is for the private health providers, and I appreciate this idea of privatisation creeping in is unpopular, but actually have the wealthy take some of the weight off the NHS.
But sorry, and that's wrong. No, that's the answer. It's not fair.
You're paying for it,
it's not fair.
Jumping what queue? You can't jump a queue in A&E if you've got private health cover at the moment.
But you can jump a queue for a hip operation, for example, and that has to be wrong.
There's a fundamental...
presiding over record waiting times in A&E in Scotland.
Camilla's talking about people who can making a choice.
Yes.
This is talking about people who don't want to being forced to. It's a completely different thing, and that's why John's absolutely right. It's wrong in principle, and it should never be allowed.
Can I point out the root cause of that, though? Because if you read a bit further down those leaked papers, it's talking about the SNP Scottish Government setting such a breadth of targets that the NHS Scotland guys are struggling to find.
Well, they were very high targets. But can I just ask you a political question on Rishi Sunak? Because as Camilla saying, it's been covered as a story that he has some private healthcare or private GP consultations were paid for them. Is that wrong or right?
I don't know. And actually, to be fair to somebody that's quite private, I'm not going to get into it. But I think what you can do is judge us on the actions. There's the best part of £8 billion going into the NHS after the autumn statement in the next 2 years.
I'm going to stop you there. Thank you very much. Let's go into the chamber.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know that members across the House will want to join me in wishing both England and Wales the best of luck for the World Cup. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Jonathan Gillis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. People in places like Stoke-on-Trent North, Kidsgrove and Tork aren't getting the help they need quickly enough when it comes to mental health. Fellow campaigner James Starkey and I were delighted when the Prime Minister, who was then Chancellor, said he would back our campaign every step of the way to get mental health nurses into GP surgeries. So will the Prime Minister deliver on his promise, back our No Time to Wait pilot scheme developed by the Royal College of Nursing and help get people the support they need?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend for his continued campaigning on this important issue. I'm pleased to tell him all 1,250 primary care networks in England are entitled to recruit up to 2 mental health practitioners to work in surgeries. I know the BMA and NHS are looking at expanding that, and I look forward to working with him to ensure that his constituents in Stoke get the mental health support and care that they need.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and congratulations to England and Wales on their start to the World Cup, and good luck for the rest of the tournament. Mr. Speaker, the World Cup doesn't belong to FIFA, and it doesn't belong to the host nation. It belongs to everyone who loves football. It's totally unacceptable that during this tournament, gay football fans are unable to acknowledge who they love, and players have been threatened with suspension if they show solidarity with those fans. Shame on FIFA. Britain faces the lowest growth of any OECD nation over the next 2 years. Why?
Mr. Speaker, this country has experienced since 2010 the 3rd highest growth in the G7. This year, the fastest growth in the G7, and unemployment at a multi-decade low. We're getting on to deliver more growth, Mr. Speaker. We're delivering free ports. We're investing in apprenticeships. We're protecting R&D. And if the Labour Party is serious about actually supporting growth, maybe they should get on the phone with their union paymasters and tell them to call off the strikes.
Mr. Speaker,
Order. We want to get through Prime Minister's questions, and you're not helping me. Keir Starmer.
He's in total denial. We're bottom of the 38 OECD countries who are all in the same boat when it comes to COVID and Ukraine. And he wants a pat on the back. It's like a football manager, bottom of the league at Christmas, celebrating an away draw 3 months ago, and it won't wash. So they don't like their record, that's the problem. So let's try it another way. Why is Britain set to be the first country into recession and the last country out?
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased that the Right Honourable Gentleman brought up the OECD report because it contained actually 3 very important points. Firstly, it made the point that actually in the years following the pandemic, we're projected to have almost the highest growth amongst our peer countries. It also made the point it was crystal clear that the challenges we face are completely international in nature. And thirdly, Mr. Speaker, it supported our fiscal plan because it's credible and ensures sustainability. Now, the Right Honourable Gentleman would have known all of that if he actually read the whole report. But he's not interested in substance. He's an opportunist, Mr. Speaker. In 4 weeks, Mr. Speaker. In 4 weeks, I've strengthened the economy. We've put more money into the NHS and schools. We've delivered a deal to tackle illegal migration. In the same 4 weeks, all we've...
Prime Minister, when I stand, you've got to sit down. But can I just say to you, you came to me quite rightly and said to me, we want to get through Prime Minister's questions. I'm going to give short answers. Please stick to what you have.
Well, Mr. Speaker, there's only one party that's crashed the economy, and they're sitting there. And I noticed this, Mr. Speaker. I noticed this. He won't say why Britain is set to be the first into a recession and the last out. So I will. 12 years of Tory failure, followed by 12 weeks of Tory chaos. For a decade, they've let our economy drift aimlessly before suddenly cutting the parachute ropes and slamming it to the ground. And because of the changes he's made, a typical household will end up with tax increases of £1,400. They don't want to hear about these tax increases of £1,400. Contrast that to a super wealthy non-dom living here but holding their income overseas. How much more...
Order. Mr. Young, I don't need any more. I don't need shouting, don't need pointing. You're meant to be a good example when you sit on this front bench. Because you're the second, don't spoil what you're meant to do.
Mr. Speaker, I don't think they want to hear this. Because of the changes he's made, a typical household will end up paying tax increases of £1,400. Contrast that to a super wealthy non-dom living here but holding their income overseas. How much more has he asked them to pay?
Just order. As I said to the Prime Minister, I said to the Leader of the Opposition, I'm going to get through this list. I need you both to help me and think of other members. Come on.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Labour had 13 years to address this issue and did nothing. Nothing. It was the Conservative government that took action and tightened the rules. But the problem with his idea is that it would end up costing Britain money. Not my words, the words of the former Labour Shadow Chancellor. But rather than peddling fairy tales and gesture politics, let's actually tell him what we're doing to deliver for this country. A record increase in the national living wage, protecting millions from energy bills, protecting the pensioners' triple lock. That's what we're doing for this country.
Mr. Speaker, if they'd grown the economy at the same rate as the last Labour government, we'd have tens of billions of pounds more to spend on that. And Mr. Speaker, it wasn't a trick question. The answer is he's not asked non-doms to pay a penny more. No. Every year, he talks about the money. Every year, that's £3.6 billion thrown away because he won't make them pay their taxes here. Right. How many extra doctors could Britain afford with that money?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased that he brought up doctors, because last week we delivered record increases in funding for the NHS. Not just more doctors, but more nurses, more scans, more operations. That shows our commitment to prioritise the NHS. Not my words, the words of the NHS Chief Executive.
Scrapping the non-dom status would allow us to train 15,000 doctors every year. That's what Labour would do. And we can carry on handing out tax breaks to the super-rich. Or we can live in a society where people don't have to go private to get a doctor's appointment. It's that simple. He also hands Shell 90p for every £1 they spend drilling. So they haven't paid a penny in windfall tax. Mr. Speaker, you may have seen this week that somebody shredded £10,000 in protest at those propping up an oil and gas giant. But he shreds £10,000 every other minute propping them up. Oh. Which does he think is the more absurd?
Mr. Speaker, this is the government that has actually put in place an economic plan that will deliver confidence and stability to our economy. And all I've heard from the Honourable Gentleman today, there's no answers, there's no substance, because there's no plan, Mr. Speaker. He talks about the NHS. We're delivering record funding for the NHS, but we can only do that on the foundations of a strong economy. You can't deliver for the NHS unless you have a plan for the economy, and he doesn't have either, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, every time he opens his mouth, another powerful business voice says he hasn't got a plan on growth. Yeah. The failure of the last 12 years and the chaos of the last 12 weeks are compounded by the decisions he's taking now. He won't follow Labour's plan to scrap non-dom status. Instead, we've got an NHS staffing crisis. He won't follow Labour's plan to make oil and gas giants pay their fair share. Instead, he hammers working people. And he won't push through planning reform. Instead, he kills off the dream of home ownership. Too weak to take on his party, too weak to take on vested interest. 12 long years of Tory government, 5 Prime Ministers, 7 Chancellors. Why do they always clobber working people?
Mr. Speaker, he talks about leadership. This summer, I stood on my principles and told the country what they needed to hear, even though it was difficult. When he ran for leader, he told his party what they wanted to hear. And even now, he says one thing and he does the other. He says he cares for working people, but he won't stand up to the unions. He said he'd honour Brexit, but he tried to have a second referendum. And now he tries to talk tough about immigration, but he promised to defend free movement. You can trust him to deliver for his party. You can trust me to deliver for the country.
Ruth Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we debate how to best help our constituents with their energy costs, 10 million people in Ukraine are without power due to Russia's barbaric strikes on the country's energy infrastructure. So can my right honourable friend set out what support we will be providing to our Ukrainian allies to help them repair the damage and keep their citizens warm this winter?
I'm pleased to tell my honourable friend that I spent time discussing this with President Zelensky at the weekend and talking to Ukrainian families about the impact these awful strikes are having on them. I know the whole House will be proud to know that we're providing millions of pounds of immediate support with generators, shelter and water repairs on top of the £570 mobile power generation that we are donating to power facilities across Ukraine. We're also working with the government to repair critical infrastructure, with 8 projects identified by UK Export Finance to be delivered in the near future.
We now come to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm sure the whole House will want to join me in welcoming the Moderator of the Church of Scotland to our proceedings this afternoon, and to thank him for his sermon at St Margaret's this morning. Mr Speaker, this morning the Supreme Court clarified a point of law, but the very point of democracy in this union is now at stake, and democracy will not be denied. Because whether Westminster likes it or not, last year the people of Scotland voted for a Scottish Parliament with a majority and the mandate to deliver an independence referendum. The Prime Minister has every right to oppose independence. He has no right to deny democracy to the people of Scotland. If the Prime Minister keeps blocking that referendum, will he at least be honest and confirm that the very idea that the United Kingdom is a voluntary union of nations is now dead and buried?
Well, Mr Speaker, let me start by saying we respect the clear and definitive ruling of the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom. And what I would say to the honourable gentleman, firstly, I am looking forward to also seeing the Moderator of Scotland tomorrow. And I think that the people of Scotland want us to be working on fixing the major challenges that we collectively face, whether that's the economy, supporting the NHS, or indeed supporting Ukraine. Now is the time for politicians to work together, and that's what this government will do.
Ian Blackford.
Mr Speaker, it is right that we respect the decision of the court. But the Prime Minister can't claim to respect the rule of law and then deny democracy in the very same breath. If democracy is to matter, if elections matter, then mandates matter. Since 2014, the Scottish National Party has won 8 elections in a row. Last year, we won a landslide. The Scottish Parliament now has the biggest majority for an independence referendum in the history of devolution. The Prime Minister doesn't even have a personal mandate to sit in 10 Downing Street. What right does a man with no mandate have to deny Scottish democracy?
But, Mr Speaker, when it comes to Scottish democracy, I'm pleased that the Scottish Government has one of the most powerful devolved assemblies anywhere in the world. And I'm pleased, and I was pleased, very shortly after becoming Prime Minister, to be the first Prime Minister in over a decade to attend the Council, to sit down with the First Minister, to explore ways in which we can work together with the Scottish Government to deliver for the people of Scotland. Whether that's delivering our growth deals, delivering free ports, or ensuring that the £1.5 billion of extra Barnett money can go towards supporting public services, that's what we're committed to doing in Scotland.
Gareth Johnson.
Mr Speaker, last month, Just Stop Oil clambered up the Dartford crossing, causing chaos for days. They then attacked artworks, the M25, and anything else to cause misery and mayhem. These people are not protesters, they are criminals. Will the Prime Minister therefore consider making Just Stop Oil a prescribed organisation so that they can be treated as the criminal organisation they actually are?
Mr Speaker, the kind of demonstrations we've seen recently disrupt people's daily lives, they cause mass misery for the public, and they put people in danger. The police have our full support in their efforts to minimise this disruption and tackle reckless and illegal activity. The Public Order Bill will give them the powers they need, and I look forward to seeing the support that bill receives from every part of this House.
Ed Davey.
Mr Speaker, one of my constituents, Vanessa, has contacted me in floods of tears. Her mortgage payments have risen by £500 a month. She and her husband were already struggling with high energy bills and high food bills. Now, like 1 in 4 across the country, they fear losing their home. We are out of options and heartbroken, says Vanessa. So will the Prime Minister introduce a new mortgage protection fund paid for by reversing his tax cuts to the banks? Will he help Vanessa keep her home?
Mr. Speaker, I'm deeply sorry to hear about Vanessa's circumstances, and I want her to know that the plan that the Chancellor announced last week will help families like hers up and down the country, because it's the right plan to tackle inflation, to limit the increase in mortgage rates and ensure confidence in our economy. There is specific help that the Chancellor announced, offering low-interest loans to those owners on benefits to cover interest on mortgages of up to $250,000. The Chancellor is also meeting with mortgage lenders in the coming weeks, and we will continue to do all we can to support those homeowners who are struggling with their payments.
Greg Tracy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recently took part in the Pitching In campaign, which promotes grassroots sports and also celebrates the volunteers who make it possible every week. So would the Prime Minister join me in thanking those volunteers for the incredible work they do? And also, with top flight football taking a bit of a break at the moment because of the World Cup, would he join me in reminding people that it's the perfect opportunity to go out and support their local non-league football teams who are incredibly welcoming, and including in that, of course, Atherstone Town Community Football Club, Bedworth United and Coleshill Town in my constituency.
Well, I'm happy to join my honourable friend in praising all his local teams, and he makes an excellent point, actually, that volunteers have a vital role to play in community sport and actually the delivery of major events, and I join him in thanking them for everything that they do. Sport accounts for over half, Mr. Speaker, of volunteering in the UK, and every one volunteer generates a capacity for at least 8 more people to participate in sport, and I know the whole House will join me in praising their efforts.
Alan Dorrance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good afternoon. Mr. Speaker, since 2014, the SNP have won 8 elections, and we now have more councillors, members of the Scottish Parliament, and more MPs in this place than any other Scottish political party. Every one of those elected members were elected on a manifesto and clear mandate for Scottish independence. Mr. Speaker, what democratic right does this government have to deny Scottish democracy, refuse an independence referendum, and to keep us shackled and imprisoned in this involuntary and unequal union against the will of the Scottish people?
Well, Mr. Speaker, again, we respect the decision of the court today with regard to the referendum, and we're getting on with the business of working constructively, collaboratively, in partnership with the Scottish Government to deliver for his constituents. Indeed, the Ayrshire Growth Deal is investing over £100 million to make use of his region's strong industrial heritage, potentially making more use of renewable energy. That's the kind of positive project we should be focused on, and that's what we'll keep on delivering.
John Penrose.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has rightly promised to recruit a successor to Lord Geidt as his ethics advisor promptly. But would he accept that threats to integrity are often broader than the job description of the Prime Minister's advisor on the Ministerial Code? And will he therefore commit to introduce the additional measures in the new 5-point integrity plan on topics like lobbying and conflicts of interest, developed with organisations like Transparency International and Spotlight on Corruption, to show he will walk the talk and put party integrity and government integrity at the heart of our democracy?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his comprehensive and thoughtful suggestions. As he acknowledged, he knows that I've committed to appointing an independent advisor on ministerial interests, and I very much look forward to studying his other proposals in proper time.
Chris Law.
Mr. Speaker, just 3 months ago, this appointed interim Prime Minister said in Scotland, and I quote, "We live in a union, which is of course there by consent and by democracy." And added, "I accept that." Well, Mr. Speaker, by their consent and by democracy, the Scottish people have already voted by a clear majority in the Scottish Parliament to have their say through a referendum on the independent future for Scotland. So it begs the ultimate question, Mr. Speaker. Can this Prime Minister tell us if he accepts Scottish democracy? And if so, how that's compatible with today's Supreme Court ruling that clearly exposes the myth that the UK is a voluntary union and is upheld by consent?
Mr. Speaker, at a time like this, the Scottish people want to see their governments working together. working together on the things that matter to them. And I believe that that is possible. And actually, he should know this, Mr. Speaker. In his own constituency, we've been able to support culture and tourism, working together to bring the V&A to Dundee. That's an example of a positive project. It demonstrates the benefits of the union, and that's what we'll keep on delivering.
So Paul Beresford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend will be aware that the government provides a slim financial support across 5 firms for small modular reactors. A few other countries have woken up and are seriously investing in SMRs. As Sizewell will not be running until 2031 at the earliest, should we not be doing the same?
No, my honourable friend actually makes an excellent point, and hopefully he was heartened to hear what the Chancellor said last week, that we want to crack on with our overall nuclear programme. And I think he's right to acknowledge that small and advanced nuclear reactors have the potential to play a key role in that nuclear programme alongside projects like Hinkley and Sizewell. That's why we've allocated £385 million to support them, and like him, I'm keen to see progress as soon as possible.
Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. During the 2014 referendum, we were told that Scotland was an equal partner in a family of nations. Yet the disaster that is Brexit was forced on Scotland against our will, and we see devolution wound back by legislation such as the Internal Market Act. So if the Prime Minister still claims the UK is a voluntary union, can he explain the democratic route by which the people of Scotland get to make a choice over their own future?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the UK is a collaborative and constructive union that is delivering for the people of Scotland. Even in Ayrshire itself, where we're working collaboratively with the Scottish Government to invest in aerospace, advanced manufacturing and space. Those are the types of activities that will bring tangible benefit to the people in her region, and that's the right focus for the Government.
Angela Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a North Yorkshire MP, my right honourable friend will know how crucial bus services are to our communities. Last month, Arriva stopped the only bus between Selby and Doncaster, meaning that 40 Selby College students had to find, at very short notice, alternative transport to get to college. Thankfully, the college itself stepped in to resolve the situation. Additionally, across North Yorkshire, around 80 other bus services are now under threat. Can he advise what action he will take to ensure that essential services are not withdrawn at short notice, and ensure that these are continued to be operated across Selby District and wider North Yorkshire?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right, and he knows that I share exactly the same challenges that he faces in our rural areas of making sure that our constituents have access to the bus services they need. I'm pleased that the Chancellor's allocated funding for extra bus services across the country, and I look forward to working with him to ensure that that money finds its way to rural areas like North Yorkshire to provide the connectivity that's so important for people to have opportunity and get access to public services.
Olivia Blake.
May I refer the House to my register of interests? Mr. Speaker, tomorrow marks 1 year since 32 people lost their lives in the Channel. New evidence suggests that the boat reached British waters and that the French and British authorities knew that it was in distress for a very long time. Families are still waiting for answers from the Marine Accident Investigation. Why has this investigation taken so long? Will he commit to a full public inquiry afterwards? And does he concede that this would not have happened if there were safe and legal routes into the UK?
Well, Mr. Speaker, every life that is lost in the Channel is a tragedy, but that is why it is so vital that we break the cycle of criminal gangs that are exploiting people and trafficking them, and that's what the Home Secretary is focused on. We have accepted over 380,000 people over the past few years because this is a place where people can seek refuge and sanctuary, but we must be able to do that in a sustainable way, and that's why it's right that we tackle illegal migration.
Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, rising energy bills were challenged
for all of us. And constituents in Sleaford and North Hykeham are very grateful for much of the support that has been given by government. But with temperatures this week falling below freezing in Lincolnshire, those living in park homes are particularly concerned when they will receive their support. So I ask my honourable friend the Prime Minister, can he tell me when and how people living in park homes will receive the £400 which they're entitled to?
And my honourable friend has consistently and rightly championed her rural constituents, making sure that they get access to the energy support that we're providing. It's something that the Chancellor prioritised in last week's autumn statement. I will ensure that we get the money out as quickly as possible. She should also be reassured that the cold weather payment system provides extra financial support to those vulnerable constituents when temperatures drop below a certain point.
Callaghan.
Mr. Speaker, did Scotland vote for Brexit?
No.
Did Scotland vote for austerity?
No.
Did Scotland vote for the Tories?
No.
What we did vote for, don't shout me down, don't shout me down, I've listened to all of you. What we did vote for only last year was the right to choose our own future. With that in mind, and given a previous non-answer from the Prime Minister, can the Prime Minister tell this House, tell us all in fact, how a nation can leave this so-called voluntary union?
Mr. Speaker, the challenges that we face right now are those that require cooperation between our governments, tackling the economy, supporting the NHS, and I'm pleased that last week's autumn statement means that the Scottish Government will receive £1.5 billion in extra funding to deliver for public services in Scotland, and that's what we will continue doing.
Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Scotland is a proud nation with a unique heritage. It is a valued member of our family of nations, a union of people bound through the generations by shared interests. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that this morning's Supreme Court decision gives the Scottish nationalists, the SNP, the opportunity for once to put the people of Scotland first? And end its obsession with breaking us apart.
I think that my right honourable friend put it very well, Mr. Speaker.
Angus Brendan McNeill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister won't answer, but it's obvious that the route to Scottish independence is now elections, and we know Prime Ministers going to be many of them. Now, Mr. Speaker, inequality cost, and in France, the middle earners earn 20% more than in the UK, and low earners earn 25% more. This inequality is why the cost of energy and the cost of living hits people worse in the UK, and it's why I'm for independence, incidentally, to choose a better path. But meantime, in my constituency, there are both more off-grid fuel customers and a higher rate of fuel poverty than in Northern Ireland. So will the PM do the right thing and extend the £200 payment that's going to Northern Ireland to the off-grid customers in my geographically distinct constituency, the Hebrides, on the basis of fairness? Yes or no?
Mr. Speaker, last week's autumn statement announced £55 billion to support families and businesses across the United Kingdom with their energy bills. And the Chancellor paid particular attention to those that are off-grid in rural areas by doubling the support to £200 for them, and that will help many people in his constituency and across the United Kingdom.
Sarah Brentcliffe.
Speaker, I'm sure we'll both be celebrating this weekend what we consider to be one of the best days of the year, and that is Lancashire Day. Thank you personally for hosting the event in Parliament. So will the Prime Minister, though he represents a Yorkshire constituency, join me in welcoming our Lancastrian local leaders and businesses to Parliament's Day, and join us in supporting our proud history and bright future by levelling up what we consider to be the best county?
May I offer my best wishes to my honourable friend, and indeed to you, Mr. Speaker, for Lancashire Day. And I can put local rivalry aside on this occasion to join her in thanking Lancastrians for their contribution to our country and to wish her the very best for today's event.
Kirsten Oswald.
Mr. Speaker, what we've heard from the Prime Minister today is, in essence, that no matter how Scotland votes, Westminster will decide.
Yep.
But democracy demands differently to that. Mr. Speaker, the late Canon Kenyon Wright said, What if that other voice we know so well says, we say no and we are the state? Well, we say yes and we are the people. And it is the people in Scotland who have to be heard. This place can't stand in the way of democracy. And if this Prime Minister with no mandate thinks it can, is he seriously telling us that this is a voluntary union of equals?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we are focused not on the SNP, but on the people of Scotland. That's who we're delivering for. I'm happy to meet with the First Minister, as I continue to do, to deliver for them, whether it's in her own constituency with a growth deal, whether it's moving civil service jobs to Scotland, whether it's delivering free ports or indeed the extra funding for public services. This is a government that will deliver for the people of Scotland, and we will do it constructively and collaboratively.
Order, order. I would now like to make a statement.
Well, that brings us to the end of this session of Prime Minister's Questions. The final question posed to Rishi Sunak from Kirsten Oswald, Deputy Leader of the SNP at Westminster, unsurprisingly in the wake of that important ruling from the Supreme Court about a second independence referendum. We'll talk about that later on in this part of Politics Live. But first of all, let me welcome our guests. Victoria Atkins for the Government, Treasury Minister, Thangam Debonair, Shadow Leader of the Commons, and Nick Eardley, Chief Political Correspondent for the BBC. Welcome to all of you. First of all, they did seem to get into their stride, I thought. Both Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, and Keir Starmer, the Labour leader. In fact, it felt like a Chamber and Prime Minister's Questions of old to me, pre-pandemic almost.
It felt a bit like what I think we're going to hear a lot over the next 2 years in a run-up to a general election, didn't it? The basic arguments over whether you need a change of government, change of party at the heart of power. I think you're right. I think they did both get into their stride. Rishi Sunak a bit more than he has over the past couple of weeks. I think he's struggled sometimes in the past couple of weeks and had a pretty tough time of it. Today we got that kind of voluminous debate on the economy, and I think the themes we heard there are going to crop up a lot.
And most of the questions, in fact, if not all, were on the economy and, in fact, how well the UK economy is going. Let's talk to Peter Barnes from the Political Research Unit here at the BBC, because, Peter, as you would expect, there were conflicting numbers being presented by both the Prime Minister and the Labour leader on how well the UK is doing, particularly in terms of growth. You've been looking into it. What did you find?
Yeah, well, the reason they were arguing about this is that yesterday the OECD, which is this international economics organisation, published its latest version of its economic outlook. And that goes through all the major economies in the world and other advanced countries and comes up with forecasts for how they expect those economies to grow this year and over the next 2 years. And in fact, both Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak basically did say true things at the beginning of the debate. So Starmer's first question was about the fact that over the next 2 years, he asked, why is it that the UK is going to be the slowest growing economy of the OECD countries? Now, that is what the OECD report from yesterday says. They estimate that next year the UK economy is going to grow by minus 0.4%. It's going to shrink by 0.4%. And then the following year, it is going to grow by 0.2%. Now, if you add those two figures together, that is the worst performing country over the next 2 years. Now, Rishi Sunak's answer to that was really to look back at this year's growth figures, where the OECD says, as he puts it, that the UK will have the fastest growing economy of the G7 countries this year. So he's looking at a different year this year, and he's looking at a smaller group of countries, the G7, the 7 biggest advanced economies in the world. But he was able to say something that was true. So obviously the political argument, as Nick says, is going to go on probably until the next general election as which party is best for the economy. But they're going to keep trading these conflicting stats, looking at different years and different sets of countries.
Peter Barnes, thank you very much. Well, Victoria, it won't surprise you that I'm going to start with the figure from the OECD, the latest forecast that says the UK economy is predicted to contract by 0.4% next year, and that is lower than any other major advanced economy. Why?
Well, we are in very, very difficult times. So we know about the international shocks of both the war in Ukraine and the aftermath of the pandemic. We know that this is having an impact not just in our economy, but across the world. So just as we are seeing higher rates of inflation, we're seeing even higher rates of inflation in comparable economies such as Germany, the Netherlands and Italy. We're also having to put we have seen interest rates rise, but they have risen more quickly in the States and in Canada and elsewhere. So it is a very difficult picture internationally.
Yes.
We were trying to address this in the autumn statement last week. We have not shied away from how difficult these times are. But what I am pleased about is that the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility has said that our plans have made the recession shallower, have helped cut inflation by some 2%, primarily through the energy price guarantee, and has protected some 70,000 jobs. So these are difficult times, but our plans are beginning to have real action.
Banger?
There are difficult circumstances, and of course there are international factors, but we've had the Truss Kwarteng budget, and the impact that that's had has been absolutely devastating. Interest rates are worse than they needed to be because of that budget, and we all know that. We all know constituents whose mortgages have gone up to eye-watering rates because of that. And then on top of that, it's not just about the last 12 weeks, it's about the last 12 years, which unfortunately the Tory government, successive Tory governments, didn't just fail to mend the roof while the sun was shining, they blew the roof off. Households will be £1,400 worse off with tax hikes under this government. That doesn't sound to me like it's not our fault, everyone else is just as bad. I'm afraid there are too many circumstances which are specifically to do with this Tory government and its predecessors.
In fairness, the aftermath of the mini-budget, we fully accepted that we tried to go too far, too fast with that. And interestingly, the Governor of the Bank of England, when he was giving evidence this week to the Treasury Select Committee, said that the market dynamics that created have flushed through the system. They peaked in sort of mid to late October.
I think
they've now flushed through the system.
Say that to people who came off fixed-rate mortgages that week.
Absolutely, and I'm being very, very careful.
I mean, they're real-world consequences.
They're real-world consequences.
Which is why the autumn statement is so critical, because it's going to have real-world consequences to help manage these very difficult times.
And it still comes back to that initial question, Victoria. Why is the UK set to have such low economic growth? I take your point about inflation. There are some countries in the G7 have higher rates of inflation. But compared to comparable countries in the G7, we're going to be at the bottom of that economic growth next year.
So the Treasury is always a little bit careful about making international comparators on growth predictions, because the way that different institutions... Well, the way that different institutions measure them are different, and the way in which our public sector output is measured is slightly different. But I do not shy away from the fact that these are very tough times at the moment. It's tough for businesses, which is why we've got the support package on business rates, trying to help our local high streets. It's tough for individual families, which is why we've made the richest pay taxes with the...
Well, that's what you wanted, isn't it? I mean, you were here not that long ago saying the broadest shoulders
they absolutely should
shoulder. The broadest shoulder should shoulder. The broadest shoulder should take on most of the burden of tax rises, and they will.
And yet, we've still got the non-doms tax break for the super rich, which would pay, if we scratch that, the £3.2 billion that we'd gain would pay for 15,000 extra doctors each year. Shell has paid no tax whatsoever on the so-called windfall tax, which is a classic example of taking a really good Labour idea and then ruining it by giving a tax break for the oil and gas companies. And we're still the lowest predicted performing country in the OECD for economic growth over the next 2 years. And that is because there is no Tory plan for growth. We know there isn't. There wasn't one given last week. There wasn't one. There was just a stabilising, so-called stabilising.
Well, we've talked about the sort of conflicting figures, and you can respond to what Fangham is saying. But what is the government's plan to get growth and turn these figures around? Because presumably that's what you're trying to do in the Treasury.
Very much so. And just on this point about non-doms, because we've had 2 days of budget debate, or autumn statement debate. It's really interesting. Labour's putting so much emphasis on this. And they say on their figures it will save £3 billion. We have a situation where we had to find £55 billion. And specifically on non-doms, in the last financial year for which we have full figures, they were liable to pay £7.9 billion in taxes. They've invested £6 billion through various investment schemes that we have set up since 2012. So
we still want to tax them.
and they are paying those taxes. That's the point.
And what about
so
the
we're going to have a status to deal with
but
these
where's the
people,
plan
as
for,
lots of
the
other
plan for
countries
growth?
do.
None of that is a plan for growth.
So
I mean, you mentioned business
Let me
rates.
get on to that.
You know, a business rates subsidy or something you mentioned. Well, what about actually reforming business rates? Because businesses, surely the ones in your patch, Victoria, are saying the same thing as the ones in my patch, which is this is a broken system, well overdue for reform. And instead, all you've got is a bit of a thing here and a bit of a thing there. That's not a plan for growth.
Well, business rates are a really important way of raising funds for local communities.
I agree.
So our councils
Let's have a good system
collect the systems. What we've done this year with the support package is ensure that we protect the smallest businesses, both in those properties where they may not have to pay any rates. And if they do see an increase, we've got a very, very generous support package with tapering and
But the thing is,
protections
it's not
for
just
them.
Labour. Just briefly, it's not just Labour, the opposition, it's also Conservative MPs. There are stories in both the Telegraph and the Mail today. Esther McVeigh, Kit Malthouse, former ministers and cabinet ministers who just don't think you can tax your way to growth, which is what they're complaining about. What do you say to them and the rebellion that's growing?
Well, in fairness, I mean, we won the autumn statement vote last night.
You did?
With a very large majority, and I'm extremely grateful to colleagues. And I know for some colleagues, some of these debates, they're very difficult. You know, I didn't come into politics to raise taxes. I want people to keep more of their money.
Well, there's a real
but
backlash.
we're having to, we have tried to make sure that these tax raises are as fair as possible and compassionate, but also don't hurt growth. And because that's how we're going to get out of this.
They all cheered Liz Truss's budget. They all cheered.
Nick, how dangerous is that rebellion?
Well, look, the ideological battle that was played out over the summer is still there. There are Conservatives who say taxing your way to growth is mad. There are others, like the new government, who say you need to get on top of inflation first. And it's just one of those things that's bubbling under the surface I think is actually quite dangerous for the Prime Minister.
Right, we're going to talk about something else that could also be, and is already, growing into a rebellion. Let's just have a look at this in the Daily Telegraph. Tory rebellion forces Rishi Sunak to put house building target on pause. Vote on plans to build a mandatory 300,000 homes a year pulled after 50 Conservative MPs come out against it, including our next guest, Theresa Villiers, the Conservative MP. She's there in Central Lobby. Hello to you, Theresa. You've promised amendments to Rishi Sunak's Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, which has led him to delay his plans. Why?
Because I believe that top-down, centrally set targets in the planning system are undermining local decision-making. I completely agree we need new homes, but we need the right homes in the right places. And the best way to deliver that is through allowing local communities to take their own decisions on planning.
But many people say they just don't take those decisions and those houses don't get built. I mean, are you holding the Prime Minister to ransom over this issue, Theresa?
No, I'm not, but it's something that my constituents really care about, and many of my backbench colleagues do. The way these targets are calculated, I think, is wrong, and they're delivering excessive numbers in certain parts of the country. Whereas, if we took measures, for example, to tackle land banking, the practice by which developers get planning permission and then don't build in order to try and drive up prices, if we address those kinds of practices, that's another way to deliver new homes without these excessive targets which are undermining local councils.
Theresa, I'm going to show our viewers, and I'll read to you a tweet from your colleague Simon Clarke. He was the Secretary of State for Levelling Up Housing and Communities a short while ago under Liz Truss. He has said, if you want to see what the future of the Conservatives is when we don't build homes, just look at London, where you're an MP. Our collapsing vote in the capital is at least in part because you can't make the case for popular conservatism if you can't afford to buy or even rent. He's got a point, hasn't he?
But just a few weeks ago, Simon Clarke was saying that these top-down targets weren't working, and he was committing to abolish them as Secretary of State. I am the first to say that we need to deliver new homes. Indeed, new homes are being delivered in my constituency.
How many?
But I think that many thousands over the past years, actually. And there are many thousands that are in prospect. But I do believe that we need to make sure that development is is suitable for the neighbourhood in which it's built and doesn't damage our environment. And targets at the moment are damaging our environment.
I mean, it sounds eminently sensible, Teresa, but the reality, as you know, is that it does give power to what we call NIMBYs, who object to any development in their area. If there aren't mandatory targets, if everything is advisory, it just doesn't happen. We know that because we haven't built enough homes for years.
What we have the example of, actually, is the neighbourhood planning system that was introduced by the Conservatives around 10 years ago, which is plans for smaller areas, giving local people more control and responsibility over home building. And actually, those have shown that people, when they're given that responsibility, actually are quite ambitious in terms of the number of new homes they want to deliver. So I think empowering local communities has real advantages in the planning system, and that's been demonstrated by neighbourhood plans.
Victoria, what would you say to Teresa and her position and stance putting this amendment to this bill?
Well, look, we very much have listened to Teresa and others on this. I mean, we want planning and building to happen with local consent. That's always been our philosophy on this.
But is she wrong? Is she wrong to want it to be advisory and let local authorities decide rather than mandatory, which is what the government wants?
Yeah, so look, it was a manifesto promise that we were going to build, I think, 300,000 more houses. We have, for various reasons, including, of course, the impact of the pandemic, we haven't yet met that number. And it's really critically important for, I think, not just younger generations, but we have all sorts of different family models and living patterns nowadays. We have to have the housing stock to be there for people when they need them to make their own homes. And so what we're doing at the moment, we're listening to Teresa and others, but we do, of course, want to encourage house building in the right areas and do that with local consent.
I mean, Teresa, it was a manifesto commitment. Do you accept that?
There's a manifesto commitment to an overall national target. The focus of my amendment is the top-down targets imposed on individual local authority areas, which are excessive. They're based on out-of-date population figures, and they're undermining local democracy and local decision-making in planning. That's why I want to see them altered.
Just before we let you go, Teresa, because I know you want to go into the chamber, are you confident that you can meet that target of 300,000 homes being built every year with your amendment?
I believe the amendment is crucial to restoring local decision-making.
No, but that's not the question I asked.
I would acknowledge that meeting that 300,000 manifesto target is difficult, and I think, frankly, it does need to be reviewed in terms of whether that is actually based on evidence. I don't think it is based on evidence. And when it comes to housing targets, it's an evidence-based approach that we should take.
Teresa Villiers, thank you very much. Just before I get your thoughts on that, Nick, because this is a critical issue that has been fought and wrestled over for years, successive Conservative governments and previous Labour governments. But do you think Rishi Sunak can't really control rebels like Teresa Villiers on this issue? They are not going to fall into line, are they?
Well, there will be an enormous amount of work going on behind the scenes as part of the larger Levelling Up Bill, which is a critically important piece of legislation.
Yeah, but if you can't get Tory MPs to back it...
Putting planning to one side, it's a really important piece of legislation. We will work with our colleagues. There's enormous amounts of goodwill around the table, and we will find, I'm sure, a solution to this. But we do want to
junking it, which is what Boris Johnson did.
We do want to provide homes for people and families across the country.
This is just all over the place. I'm sorry, Victoria, this is really all over the place. It just seems like another example of Rishi Sunak's weak leadership. He can't control his backbenchers. He can't stand up to vested interests. I can't really see how he's going to stand up for working households who, in my patch, and probably in yours too, there is nowhere you can get a home for rent or to purchase on an average wage. Nowhere. Absolutely nowhere. And I'm pretty sure that that's true across London as well.
What's going to happen with this, do you think, Nick?
I think it's going to be hard for Rishi Sunak to win over those 50 backbenchers who signed up to Teresa Villiers' amendment. This is one of those issues we keep coming back to. I think it was on this programme, Joe, that we revealed that the planning bill was being dropped. It then became part of the Levelling Up bill. Boris Johnson then dropped the target. Rishi Sunak's now brought it back. And there's a fundamental tension there, which is the government is adamant you need 300,000 homes a year in England by the middle of the decade, so a couple of years left to get that. but there are many MPs, and the key point for me is it's not particular parts of the party. It's all different wings of the party are unhappy about this. One of the reasons is their voters tell them that they don't want it. There's an electoral calculation going on here as well.
Right, well, let's talk about other calculations for Keir Starmer and the Labour Party, because the Labour leader made a big speech to the CBI yesterday. Now, the head of that organisation, Tony Danker, has said that if we want to turn around our prospects, then we'll need to embrace an agenda for growth, like planning reform that we've been talking about, more immigration and possibly a better relationship with the EU. Does the Labour Party want that growth agenda that's been outlined by Tony Danker, more immigration, closer ties to the EU?
Well, we do want a growth agenda, and we have a plan for growth. And
with
Keir's reception,
but that was Tony Danker's recommendation and agenda.
And one of the things that I noticed about the reception to Keir Starmer from the CBI and the reception to Rishi Sunak is it seemed rather lukewarm on Monday for Rishi Sunak, the very weak Prime Minister that we've currently got, whereas Keir on Tuesday had a very good reception. Now, we're not always going to agree on everything. We're not always going to agree on everything. That is true, I would, but I saw it with my own eyes. I watched them both.
And on the issues...
being honest on our policy on immigration, I think is really important because a long-term plan for growth can't rely on importing cheap labour to fill gaps where we haven't got the homegrown labour. We have to have a really good and balanced approach, which means a points-based immigration system, which is exactly what Keir outlined.
There is a points-based system.
And there was a very good reception to Keir's business leaders' reception on Monday. We were packed to the rafters. Sure. Business leaders are talking to all of us about how much they're looking forward to working with us.
Well, that's great. And when you say you want to be clear with people on the issue of immigration, does Labour want to cut the numbers of immigration?
Well, I think the Tory party have shown that picking an arbitrary figure at random doesn't really work. And at the moment, we're 2 years out from a general election. Picking an arbitrary figure for me at random
I don't even want you to pick an arbitrary figure. I just want you to say, one way or the other, for people watching, are you happy to see figures go up, or would you like the overall level of net migration to come down?
We would like homegrown talents to be given a chance of good paid jobs with decent working conditions, and that will also,
people would agree with you on that.
And that will sometimes include people who are coming from other countries where we have skills and talents and shortages in different areas. And at the moment, given that we're not close to an election, although I'd like to be, we can't set that overall direction in those up-down terms or even a hard and fast number.
So it's a long-term ambition to help the British economy, as Keir Starmer said, off its immigration dependency and to start investing more in training workers who are already here. If we look at the figures at the moment, it's about 240 or so thousand net migration to the UK. So in the short term, would Labour welcome higher levels of immigration until you're able to wean the UK economy off immigration from abroad?
I don't know what Victoria's government's going to left us with by the time we get into government.
But you can give a broad principle.
And I have, which is our principle is that we want to be able to give homegrown talent the chance to learn new skills and spread those good jobs across the regions and nations of this country. And that will still include immigration. It will still include...
But it's not a straight answer. I suppose that's what people...
It's difficult to say at the moment what we're going to be left with in 2 years' time. That's why I want to give you a straight answer, Joe, and I absolutely promise you that when we get closer to the election and it's clearer what state we're dealing with, I will give you exactly a much more precise figure. At the moment, I couldn't, and then you'd pick me up on it if I gave you one that I couldn't stand by in 2 years' time.
Nick?
Something that struck me about Keir Starmer's speech on Tuesday at the CBI was it was very heavy on rhetoric and a sort of broad principle about the economics of immigration. But I'm not clear at all what the specifics are. What areas, for example, you think there's been an immigration dependency? Would you, for example, at the moment, say when it comes to hospitality, that people shouldn't be allowed to come to the UK to work in hospitality? Or is it just for the NHS?
One of the problems we've got at the moment is we've got a huge number of our current workforce off sick, and that's because we've got huge waiting times and waiting lists in the NHS, which we know is the case. And so there are lots of different ways of helping to sort out our workforce gaps.
So
and one of
is
them,
the UK
one
too
of them,
dependent on immigration when it comes to things like hospitality?
Well, I think that we've got into a state where our typical approach as a country is if we've got a workforce shortage, we'll import it from somewhere else, which is a cost to those other countries. So, for instance, we are importing healthcare workers from Kerala who've been trained at the expense of the Indian and Kerala state governments, and then expecting them to fill the gaps that this government and successive Tory governments have just not bothered to do anything about. In hospitality's got all sorts of problems, and one of the things that we need to do is try and get people who are currently waiting for an operation or sick off that and back into work.
I promised that we would bring any developments from Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, following the ruling by the Supreme Court. Let's just have a listen.
We must and we will find another democratic, lawful and constitutional means by which the Scottish people can express their will. In my view, that can only be an election. The next national election scheduled for Scotland is, of course, the UK general election, making that both the first and the most obvious opportunity to seek what I described back in June as a de facto referendum.
Nicola Sturgeon, de facto referendum. Does that mean at the next general election the SNP will campaign only on this issue of an independence referendum for Scotland?
I think it probably does. I think it's probably the only option that they think they have left at the moment. We had the legal question answered today: can Scotland hold a referendum without the UK's say-so? The answer to that is no. But the political question, I think, is just going to keep bubbling under. It's not going to go away. We heard it asked very many times at Prime Minister's questions there, didn't we? And I suppose, Nicola Sturgeon has that tactical question: what on earth do you do next? How do you make another referendum happen? I think Labour and the Conservatives are both going to be kept being asked the question: how does Scotland have another referendum if that's what it wants?
The answer is? What's the answer to that? If they want another referendum, how do they do it?
There's a process for these decisions. The Supreme Court has ruled that it is for the UK government to decide. They had a referendum a few years ago, and that stands.
Oh, well, we've run out of time. That's all for today. Thank you so much to all of my guests for this part of the programme. I'll be back tomorrow at 12:15. Bye-bye.
Madness. Fucking Scotland. It wasn't a slow news day though, that's for sure. Imagine the SNP campaigning on shall we have a referendum and then Labour win the next fucking election. Fucking hilarious.